On the motion, this House believes that the re-implementation of the Iran deal with its original terms unchanged will bring more harm than good. Let's call upon the Prime Minister to begin this debate. Hear.
Thank you. Before I begin my speech, just like to clarify, yes, POIs, I prefer for them to be received in chat. Can I just confirm, so far, am I audible and clear?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Friends, in this debate, we're going to be discussing the re-implementation of the Iran deal as it was originally, and whether or not that will bring more harm or more good to society as a whole. Understand that this debate takes place in regards to the whole of society and not specifically to Iran or to the US or to any other single party. I think we can both agree on both sides of this debate can agree that we don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, that the end goal of whatever decision we take here is to prevent like the nuclearization of the world and to prevent like more countries having such power that can lead to like great destruction. First, this is how I'm going to structure my speech. I think first of all, I've already kind of put this debate into context. I think next I'm going to like put more context into the side and put more context to introduce our argumentation. Then I'm going to introduce like one of our arguments, and the rest of our side's case will be introduced to you by my second speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister. First of all, let me explain to you why the context today is different than the context in the Obama administration, which was the context in which this Iran deal was originally put into place, right? And because this context is different, therefore these terms cannot be implemented again unchanged. So the reason why the context today is different is that to get this, we must first of all understand that the election of President Biden does not necessarily mean an immediate return to Obama-era politics and international relations. Right? The Trump administration cannot simply be ignored, and we must recognize that it has made changes to the world of international relations. I'll take your POI in a moment later. We must understand that the Trump administration has made changes and has affected the way the politics, not only in the U.S. and but also in global politics when it comes to the United States' foreign policy. I think just to illustrate what kind of changes that has happened in the world, I think first of all we can understand that today's context takes place in a time where there's been a general global movement away from international liberalism and a bit more like more countries focusing more on realism and in their own self-interest. Just to illustrate, we've had after Trump. A lot of rise of like more authoritarian leaders, people like Duterte in the Philippines or like Bolsonaro in Brazil, who have been given more power because they have been like given the green light in some sense by like the example set by President Trump previously. And we can also understand that like in today's world with the COVID the COVID pandemic, that even though there has been like little acts of like aids in countries helping each other, I think the current situation when it comes to those things is really not proportional to the opportunity of human unity that has been provided by the COVID pandemic. That like the COVID pandemic was an opportunity for the human race to be united against like a single common enemy. But yet, despite that, we still, because of the current context of international relations, we still decided to like do things like by country and do things quite selfishly and quite separately and quite isolationistly. And therefore, this kind of illustrates to you the general global movement away from international liberalism. I think what this means is that Iran itself, as a country, is going to be unlikely to abide by the terms of an Iran deal today, simply because it is less likely to like be cooperative with international advances as it was previously by the UNSC plus Germany. Right, and I think another thing that we have to understand to put into context is that the internal politics within the United States has also changed since the Obama administration. With the rise of President Trump and now with President Biden, we must understand that like the US politics has been extremely polarized and has been extremely divided. This is something to keep in mind for our points later on. At this point, I will take your POI.
If you want a nuclear-free world, why pick only Iran? Because a nuclear-free world means no one having nuclear power. This includes UN Security Council member Germany and so on. Please clarify.
Okay, yeah, I think we do want a nuclear-free world, but we must bear in mind that this debate today takes place in the context of Iran, and we do think that in moving towards a nuclear-free world, we do think that the re-implementation of the Iran deal will bring more harm compared to like other alternatives that opposition might provide. And we think that it is like I don't think we have to justify like why the UNSC, why certain powers like the US should remain with nuclear power. We do understand that the US has been reducing its arsenal, but it must remain in order to ensure that like other powers that are less less cooperative with its nuclear weapons will start nuclearizing like Iran. Next, to move on to a bit more to some of the more substantive arguments, I think we must understand like the implications on politics. Like before even moving on to the idea of like sanctions as a leverage against Iran or like the harms of implementing this deal, I think we must understand like the implications on politics. The idea that foreign policy, the foreign policy of the US is going to change so drastically after the 4 years. We understand that foreign policy between countries must be consistent and representative of the country as a whole, and not change according simply to the whims of each administration. I think in comparison to other countries like China and Russia and even Iran, the US has like extremely rapidly changing administrations, and the US therefore must take extra care not to like drastically change its foreign policy within a time span as short as 4 years. I think we need to understand that like if Biden were to take that stance and say like, oh, because Trump is gone and now I'm in power after 4 years, we're just like ignore everything the previous administration has done, that sets a pretty bad precedent, not only for the US and its future administrations, because there already was like backlash from Trump for simply like removing what Obama did. I think Biden should not be following the same example as Trump. I think we must understand that therefore there has been like some momentum put into place from Trump's actions, and therefore if the US, if Biden were to like follow through with re-implementing the Iran deal as it was previously, the implications here are pretty drastic, and the tangible harms here is that it's going to lead to like more examples of what Trump did in the past, which is just like removing what Obama did. And it will lead to more examples of that, which is bad, because then the US will not be able to have any like fixed policies, and it makes negotiations on the global stage a bit more difficult when its foreign policy is not so consistent. And that's actually really important, because the United States needs to be a global a strong power when it comes to international relations, and therefore cannot simply be like something that changes so constantly based on the whims of each administration, and must have a bit of consistent messaging in order to like get more people on its side and get more people to understand what the US is actually all about. So for these reasons, because we believe that the context today is truly actually different from the context in which the original Iran deal was set, and because we believe that like, if Biden were to re-implement this deal, there would be like significant implications on US politics. We understand that the US has already been polarized, and we understand that the US needs to have this position on the global stage. For these reasons, we are very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Let's have the first speaker from opposition bench, the leader of opposition. Here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool. Give me 2 seconds. In the start of my speech, I'm going to start off by just disproving the second half of PM's speech immediately, and then moving on to the first half of her speech, then going and introducing opposition's case. We tell you on our side that we also agree that nukes are bad. However, we see that to remove these nukes, GovBench has not provided any alternatives. All they have said is that, okay, Iran won't accept, and then period. They haven't gone on and told us how they're actually going to come up with a better deal. And even if Iran does not accept, which I'm going to prove later in my speech is very unlikely, even if Iran does not accept, how are you going to deal with it? How do you make the situation better? I'm going to analyze what government might do in DPM, because PM didn't come up with a model, and or like even CG. I'm going to take down all of their models right now and tell you why our model is the only one that stands in this debate. Firstly, before I move on to my substantives, some rebuttals. They come up and And the second half of PM speech is really weird. They already told you that this debate is not about the US. It's about the entire world. Yes, US is part of the entire world, but like the world's interest is probably more important than US interest. They have not told us why foreign policy has to be consistent. All they have said is because it gives a bad image of the US. But why do I care? Why should the world care about if the US has like tarnishes a little bit of their image? Firstly, we don't think the US image is going to be tarnished just because the foreign policy was not consistent. What Biden is doing, or what Biden wants to do at this moment, is to go back to Obama's presidency, or at least go back to the so-called norm that what the US was doing before Trump came along, and change it for the better or the worse, right? We tell you that Trump was the radicalist, and Biden is now telling the world that, okay, we don't really like such radical points of view. We don't like being so radical. We're going to go back to what Obama did. And even if it's like totally different from what Obama did, at least they're trying to go back to like a less radical society. We tell you the foreign policy, it's not about the foreign policy being consistent or not. It's about the US upholding their own image of being the world police as they were before Trump introduced isolationist policies. We don't see why this is a problem. And even if it is a problem, like, why does this matter in this debate? Secondly, the first part of your speech was basically talking about how Iran won't accept. I'm just gonna ignore this. I'm just gonna prove to you straight away why Iran won't accept, will accept. But firstly, some characterization. In this world, we acknowledge that Iran is developing nukes, or at least probably wants to develop nukes very much. Why do they want to do this? What is their incentive to do this? Basically, what OG has totally missed is the characterization of these actors in the debate. What do these actors actually want? We tell you the world and the US want to stop Iran from getting too powerful, or like just a new power getting nuclear weapons, because they understand how powerful these nuclear weapons can be, especially in Iran, which is sort of an unstable country, which is like which is quite has quite different ideologies from like Western liberal democracies, and also they're smack bang in the middle of the Middle East, some like a really turbulent region which like has a lot of wars and a lot of civil wars going on even right now. We tell you that introducing nuclear weapons to that area is going to be catastrophic, not only for like the safety of the international world, but also destabilizes the entire Middle East, which my DLO is going to talk about in his speech. We tell you that we need to do this because it's the best nuclear deal we have come up with so far, right? We tell you that Iran has already accepted it once before, not to say that just because they accepted it once before, they'll definitely accept it again, but they probably know the terms, they probably know what it's all about, they probably understand the entire thing. Therefore, they're more likely to make a decision quickly, whether they want to or not. But like, why do we need to push this so quickly onto Iran, right? We tell you that Iran wants to develop, they want to become a power in the Middle East and have influence over world politics. We tell you they're trying to do this by introducing nuclear weapons into their entire system. They tell you that they're trying to use mutually assured destruction, which basically means if you like nuke me, I'm gonna nuke you back, right? So we both die, right? So it's just this entire threat that like that gives them bargaining power on throughout the entire world. We tell you that this is problematic because the other countries don't probably want like Iran to have these nuclear weapons, especially in this region. But Iran wants to develop. We tell you that they can't develop anywhere else because of these like heavy sanctions that we put onto them before. We tell by uplifting these sanctions and giving Iran this like option to say that, okay, now you can develop, right? We're giving you money, we're giving you trade, we're giving you these outlets to develop, but don't develop
Point of
through
information.
nuclear means. No, thank you. We tell you that it's very important for us to do this because of urgency. What is this urgency? We tell you that Iran is probably going to develop quite quickly, even if they haven't developed like develop nuclear weapons during Trump's reign, right? We tell you why is this the case. Iran probably like they already developed or like was close to finish developing nuclear weapons before. They just like denuclearized themselves, right? We tell you that Iran still is probably going to possess the knowledge to do so. They probably just won't throw all their like blueprints away just because in no way in the JCPOA does it require that. All they require is like denuclearization. We tell you is that Iran probably still has the knowledge to do so, to like create nuclear weapons, and they probably are going to be like they can do it pretty quickly. We tell you that if you like propose any other means, like for example, negotiation. For example, you just don't do anything. Even if you come up with an alternative, it's probably going to take so long to like come to terms with Iran. They probably already have nuclear weapons already, which is terrible because now they already have like more bargaining power, so they can get more power in that international sphere. For the countries already in power, it's just terrible for them because now it's like a usurper coming to like take their power. For countries that are not so developed, it's also terrible for them because now Iran has the possibility of like coercing them into doing stuff for them, right? Now Iran has like lots of power in society instead of these other countries. No, thank you. This destabilizes the entire region. We tell you that it's very efficient because now you directly successfully limit Iran's nuclear power. We tell you it's quite straightforward. You take away their nuclear weapons, now they don't have nukes, right? It's quite straightforward like that. Iran is more likely going to accept rather than any other sort of deal that you're going to propose because it's fulfilling their need to develop. You're giving them another outlet to develop, and we tell you we also help these people in Iran who are suffering because of this economic drought, because the government just wants power and they're like trying to develop nuclear weapons instead of like thinking about the economy. We tell you it's quite important to do this. Why do other points not work? For example, negotiation or not doing anything. Not doing anything definitely doesn't work because Iran continues to become anti-Western. They spread anti-Western propaganda. You escalate the entire situation. You send a bad message that, okay, the US basically doesn't care anymore. They're not the world police. We're basically continuing Trump's reign of like isolationism, as OG characterized, more like autocratic countries are going to pop up, autocratic leaders, etc. Why negotiation won't work, I already talked about a little bit in my speech before, but Iran wants power. If you just negotiate, it's either going to take a long time or Iran just won't accept. We tell you if Iran doesn't accept, you're just going to anger Iran by like negotiating for like useless stuff that you could just use the JCPOA for, right? They're going to get angrier and they're going to destabilize the situation even more to like threaten the US into like maybe even sanctions that are better for Iran, right? We tell you this is absolutely horrible. For the betterment of the world, not just the US, for the betterment of the entire society and people in Iran, we tell you that we denuclearize Iran and we actually achieve change on OO. Therefore, very proud to propose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Let's have the next speaker, Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Give me a second to set my timer up. Before I begin my speech, POIs can be given verbally instead of in chat. And my speech starts now. 5 years ago, nearly every Republican in the US Congress and many leading Democrats, including senators, opposed the Iran deal for good reasons. The agreement set expiration dates on key restrictions, ruled out on-demand inspections, and let Iran maintain its nuclear enrichment capabilities. It didn't address the regime's accelerating missile program, gave Iran the financial resources to actually sponsor regional aggression. So therefore, by keeping this deal and re-entering this, you are defending this terrorism, supporting this human rights violence going on in those areas. The burden in this debate is if OP can justify this and all the potential undeniable harms, like having no leverage and everyone racing to go nuclear and increased tensions with the Middle East allies. Is this simply worth it? Before I begin my speech, let me offer some rebuttals. So opposition came up and said that image shouldn't matter. However, rejoining this deal would send a clear message to the Muslims that they can wait out a Biden administration in negotiations because he will never reimpose sanctions out of fear Iran might again expand its nuclear activities, which isn't the message we want to send out. We don't want the image of the US being scared. This belittles them, giving them less leverage, giving them less space in front of all their Middle Eastern allies and other countries. So given such tensions, having bad images is the last thing you want to do. And I'll later talk about how leverage is extremely important and how we achieve a better, safer, long-term deals for better negotiation and how it will actually work. So my second rebuttal is that OP came up and said that both sides will be nuked and you don't want that. Yes, we agree, but that's exactly what you're going to have on your side and we won't on ours. Iran gets to keep its vast nuclear infrastructure and missile program if you rejoin back this deal and in fact give them the financial capabilities to do even more of this and harm even more people potentially. And the promises from Iran only confirm the obvious, that the regime definitely has nuclear weapon ambitions. And then the whole neighborhood would race to go nuclear. And this deal is most likely to accelerate this proliferation, because if regional powers feel threatened by the possibility of Iran getting a weapon and the penalty for producing nuclear weapons decreases, then why wouldn't they? sorry, not now. I will further explain this later. Therefore, a nuclear-free world is more favorable on our side, and I'll further elaborate on this. They also said that US would seem like they don't care anymore. Actually, we'd be sending the exact opposite message. We'd literally keep our heavy economic sanctions proven effective at limiting their use of weapons, considering the fact that given what's going on now and their economy is going down, this would be controlled, and I'll further elaborate on this too. But now onto my speech. Hinting at these flaws, Biden says that he wants to build up the deal with a new agreement to tighten and lengthen Iran's nuclear constraints as we address a missile program. However, this threatens our partners in the region because the president-elect maintains that the only way to negotiate a new framework is by first returning to the old one, which has been proven ineffective and actually costing people's lives. And there's one big problem with the logic of returning to the old framework, which is that since rejoining the original nuclear deal requires Washington to lift its most punishing sanctions, the economic leverage against Iran that Biden inherits would evaporate the moment sanctions are relaxed. Congress had worked for years to enact tough sanctions to force the Iranian regime to abandon its activities. Even former President Barack Obama had worked for years to enact tough sanctions. And he said that it's been effective in bringing Iran to the negotiation table in the first place, which means that leverage is actually crucial for giving them dialogue and more incentives to negotiate to form a better deal in the long term later on, because Iran would know that if they aren't in this deal, that in the long term, it would be actually detrimental to them and their economy. And that's why when you pull out of these incentives to have dialogue, that's something we shouldn't do because we shouldn't take away the leverage. So Iran says that US must undo sanctions first before it pulled out of the agreement. And that's something we shouldn't do because we shouldn't take away the leverage. We shouldn't take away, not now. We shouldn't take away incentives for Iran to come forward and meet US halfway and form a better, more long-term agreement. Leverage is extremely crucial for a dialogue, and therefore it's a lot more important than whatever op is going to come up and say. If Biden were to give in nuclear extortion and abandon sanctions, he would surrender his most important leverage against Iran and never achieve his stated goal of negotiating a longer, long-lasting, better agreement. But also the regime is threatening the international community with nuclear enrichment because the agreement allowed Iran to retain its enrichment-related capabilities. So long as the regime maintains these capabilities, it can threaten to expand enrichment at any time of its choosing, which means we would have more people around the region getting threatened by these nuclear threats, which we don't want. But also, not only does a deal undermine nuclear proliferation by legitimizing Iran as a nuclear threshold state, it also undermines our allies. So here are the four most dangerous problems with the deal. First, the whole neighborhood would race to go nuclear. If regional powers feel threatened by the possibility of Iran getting a weapon without the penalties that they would face before, then why wouldn't they? More nuclear means more tensions, which means increase of violence and greater chances of everyone going nuclear. And the worst thing is for everyone to go nuclear and the escalation of actually using it, because once it's used, both sides of the fight will be in extreme crisis, considering the fact that it's already bad enough in current status quo. But second, Iran gets to keep its nuclear infrastructure and the missile program. And the promises from Iran only confirm the obvious. The regime definitely has it going on right now, because after all, why have a massive ballistic missile program and secret military nuclear facilities if the plan isn't to build more nuclear weapons to protect them from future escalations? But three, sanctions relief will make the region far less safe. The sanction relief and renewed ability to sell more oil on the open market could wind up bringing a lot more money into the Iranian economy, bolstering the Iranian government, therefore boosting and allowing them for more violence, terrorism, killings, human rights violations. Essentially, OP is coming up and saying they're trying to defend all of this. So that's why the deal would pay for undermining US policy and interests throughout the region, which we definitely don't want, because we should focus on the interests of global and our welfares. Fourth, the deal is temporary by design. Even the White House doesn't claim it will permanently keep Iran from getting a bomb. So what's the point? We instead achieve a long-term by giving Iran incentives for dialogue and long-term, better, more effective negotiations and agreements to get something where everyone can meet each other halfway. And therefore, you wouldn't be supporting things like human rights violations, increased terrorism, and everyone going nuclear. Therefore, with all these harms, the harms definitely outweigh the benefits that don't even make sense. So that's why this motion must and will stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Let's have the last speaker of the opening half, Deputy Leader of Opposition, here.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Sorry, give me a second to set up my timer. Ladies and gentlemen, OG is out of the debate because they heavily mischaracterize what is actually going on in the Iran deal, right? In my speech today, a few things I'll be doing. Rebuttals to OG, I'll be expanding on the idea of how it protects Iranian citizens. I'll be expanding on the ideas of effectiveness and necessity. And lastly, I'll be providing some new material on how it leads to the stabilization of the Middle East, right? So OG comes out and tells you a few things, right? Okay, they tell you that, for example, Iran is unlikely to accept the policy, right? We already rebut this point by telling you that because of international pressure, because of the fact that Iran has already accepted this deal before, the fact that they're already familiarized with terms and agreements, and this is why we tell you that they're much more likely to accept, right? Further elaboration in my speech later, right? They also talk about how it sends the wrong message, how negotiation is different if the US appears scared if they have an inconsistent foreign policy, right? They also talk about how Iran gets their infrastructure intact, the deal is ineffective, right? We tell you that this is simply untrue, right? We tell you that in this deal, there's specific monitoring by countries in the JCPOA, right? In this deal, there's Iran's nuclear development is going to be closely monitored by these countries that are currently in the deal, right? We tell you that this is going to effectively stall or completely stop the development of new nuclear weapons from Iran, right? We don't think that they can come out and say that it's going to be ineffective. We don't think that this point works. They also talk about how leverage is important, how the leverage is going to disappear if we don't sanction them, right? Okay, a few things. We think that given that OG is pushing for a nuclear-free world, right? We think that the leverage to decrease nuclear production can directly be countered if you directly stop their nuclear production with this deal, right? We don't think that their point about leverage stands when you can directly decrease their military influence over the world by directly implementing this deal that effectively stops the nuclear development, that stops the threat to world peace and to Iranian citizens, right? We also think on the second level, we think that Iranian government is probably going to gain even more leverage on their side, right? Because when you don't restrict any nuclear development, we think that, as we told you about in the incentive part, we think that the Iranian government probably develops nuclear weapons to gain more influence in the world because they're being sanctioned, right? We think that if you sanction them further, they're just going to develop much more nuclear weapons, they gain much more political influence in the world. We think that this is the incentive of the Iranian government. We don't think that sanctioning further is going to help because they're just going to develop more nuclear weapons to gain more political power. Sorry, no. We think that this is why whatever OG tells you doesn't work, right? They talk about lastly, they also talk about harms there's going to be further nuclear development. The neighboring countries in the Middle East are going to go nuclear, right? We don't think that this works at all. We think that this is something that is much more likely to happen on proposition side, not opposition side, right? Why? Because I already tell you, Iran probably wants to develop nuclear weapons because they want to gain influence in global politics, right? Because they can't achieve that after they've been heavily sanctioned economically. We think that when you implement this deal, this directly stops any kind of nuclear development going on in Iran, right? We think that we don't see how other countries are going to be incentivized to develop nuclear weapons. Given that, if this policy is imposed, they probably won't get to develop nuclear weapons anyway. They'll see how effective it is in stopping nuclear development. We think
Did you mute yourself?
Oh, sorry. Where did you stop hearing? Oh, sorry. Where was I up to?
It's about 4 minutes. You were just talking about directly stopping any kind of development.
Oh, okay. Then I'll continue. Okay. Yeah, okay. Moving on to my substantives, right? Okay. On the idea of how it protects Iranian citizens, we think that it's much more likely to protect Iranian citizens in the sense that, like, we already tell you when Iran is not prevented from developing nuclear weapons, we think that this is much more likely to lead to a global scale conflict, right? More elaboration on that in my point about the stabilization of the Middle East. We think that when these global conflicts occur, it's directly going to affect the safety of these people, of these Iranian people, right? We think that this is bad because there's nothing they can do about it. We think that they're very, very vulnerable in this debate because they cannot control what happens to them. We think that it's very important to protect these people simply because it is justified, right? We think that when you implement this deal, this is less likely because Iran's nuclear dealings are monitored, right? They're less likely to develop nuclear weapons. We don't think that this will lead to a global scale conflict. We managed to protect these Iranian citizens. Secondly, on the idea of necessity, right? We think that it is so necessary because Iran is growing in nuclear power, right? We think that it's so necessary because of the existing conflicts that arise because of this kind of nuclear power, right? For example, we tell you about the US Iran tensions, right? We think that these tensions have already been prevalent over the past years. For example, just look at the Persian Gulf crisis from 2019 to 2021, right? We think that these conflicts prove that there's already rising international tension, especially between US and Iran. We tell you that this tension needs to cease by decreasing their nuclear weapon development, which decreases their military threat to the entire world, right? We think this is extremely important. We think that Iran already has large stores of uranium that can be utilized to make nuclear weapons. We think that the storage is only growing by the day. We tell you that it is extremely necessary and there's an urgency to implement this policy. Lastly, new material on the stabilization of the Middle East, right? Which we solve through international policing. We think that what does it look like in the Middle East right now, right? We think that there are countries like Iran, which are spreading anti-Western ideas. There are also countries like Saudi Arabia, which are moderately influenced by Western ideas, right? We think that this stark contrast in ideologies is likely to lead to conflict. Why is the conflict in the Middle East bad, right? And also we tell you when Iran develops nuclear weapons, it's much more likely to pass over, it's much more likely to lead to danger and influence on safety of neighboring countries, right? Okay, why is this bad, right? We think that when we think that the instability of the Middle East is significant because it leads to global conflicts, right? Why? We think that the Middle East is globally and politically important because, for example, it supplies oil and energy, right? For example, we think that the instability there is much more likely to lead to conflicts on the part of other countries that rely on the Middle Eastern countries for supply of energy and oil. For example, the US has to deploy troops in the Middle East, right? Simply because of this reason. We think that a large-scale war or instability in the Middle East is going to spill over into international conflict. We tell you that this is inherently bad. We tell you that we want a safe and peaceful war on side opening opposition. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. To begin the closing half of this debate, let's call upon the Member of Government here.
All right, one thing, right? Since my notes are in a Word document, whenever someone types on the chat, it completely glitches. So even for the timings, I've got a personal timer here, and POI is autoplay. I hope that's fine. All right. 3, 2, 1. Panel, we're not saying that Donald Trump was right to back out of the deal he made with Iran. We're saying that it's one of the best things he did as the president of the United States of America. 2 reasons why that's the case. But before I get into that and get into why exactly the opening half has completely missed the point of this debate, I'm going to introduce to you why opening opposition's case makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, right? So opening opposition's case is based around 2 assumptions. The first assumption being that sanctions don't really limit nuclear power, right? And the second assumption being that they won't have any nuclear or Iran won't have any nuclear or dangerous weapons available if this deal is implemented. So as long as I can prove to you that both of these assumptions are not true, both of these assumptions, as long as I disprove them, their entire case is diminished because it was completely reliant on these two assumptions, right? First, why sanctions do limit nuclear power, right? Let's look at what happened after the US briefly entered the deal under the Obama administration, right? Iran actually finally got out of an economic recession that was limiting them from doing anything at all, an economic recession that was making their resources similar to that of an underdeveloped country, right? We tell you that after the US actually entered the deal, Iran's economy benefited a lot, allowing them even more to actually be able to develop other stuff like missiles, which wasn't a part of the deal, but I'll get to that later, right? So we tell you that economically, Iran is in a mess if these sanctions are continued, and this economic mess doesn't give them the resources, doesn't give them the flexibility in terms of like their economy to actually develop nuclear weapons, right? And that's why it's an efficient way to keep Iran in check. Secondly, they also said that Iran won't have any access to nuclear or dangerous weapons, right? We tell you that's completely false. We tell you that the deal doesn't include a lot of stuff, including their access to like a booming arsenal of missiles, but I'll get to that during my constructive. Now, they also said that Iran is going to develop more nuclear weapons. As proven earlier, the sanctions are going to ensure that that doesn't happen. If anything, they're going to develop nuclear weapons, even if the US re-enter the deal, and even if Iran actually follow what the deal stands for, the deal is flawed. And that's my first point, and that's my first substantive, right? Closing government tells you that the US was originally right to actually leave the deal. There are two reasons why that's the case. First, the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program start to relax about 10 years after the deal was signed, right? Many of the JCPOA's restrictions on Iran have like expiration dates, right? After 10 years, centrifuge restrictions will be lifted. And after 15 years, so too will limits on the amount of low enriched uranium that Iran can actually possess, right? Some of the deal's opponents faulted these so-called sunset provisions, saying that they only delay Iran building a bomb. Trump was one of these opponents, and we agree with him, right? And it doesn't like actually prevent them from building a bomb, it just delays the entire process. The second reason is that the deal didn't cover other problematic things Iran was doing. And this is exceptionally important, right? Iran has access to ballistic missile development forces, right? It supports violent militias around the Middle East. An example being Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? Iran has certainly carried out missile developments that could allow it to like deliver nuclear warheads anywhere in the region, hit like much of Europe, and even develop some form of ICBM, right? This presents an all too real potential threat if the JCPOA or alternative effects to Iran's like to actually like halt Iran's nuclear programs should fail. This proves that the deal by virtue is rotten for everyone other than Iran. What is happening in the case of Iran is, right, they're escaping sanctions and their economy is relatively booming now. But there's no assurance of the fact that they won't do anything threatening. We tell you that Iran no longer being regulated and having exclusive access to dangerous, threatening missiles, and they can and the fact that they have permission to continue inhumane acts all around the world. The US leaving the deal briefly ensured that this did not happen. Them rejoining it gives Iran that freedom again. It does ensure that this will happen. I'll get to you in a second. Right. So this is not only a major threat for the US, but also for everyone else in the world, because Iran is a threat to world peace all around. This proves that it does a lot more harm than whatever good opening up tried to suggest it does, although like from what we heard from their speech, it does no good at all, right? Secondly, we tell you that this would give Iran a lot of power, right? Iran already has a good amount of power. The only thing that's like limiting them from rising to the extent that like they're major in terms of their status is the US sanctions, right? Let me put this into context. The Iran-Iraq war led to Iran creating its own missile forces, and this is something that's unique, the revival of Iran chemical warfare and nuclear programs that Khomeini had cancelled, right? So from Iran's perspective, they've got all the resources. They've got everything they need to undermine others from using nuclear forces, right? So what happens now is the US sanctions are actually lifted. This puts Iran on a platform, because let me just give you a statistic here, right? After the US actually like implemented the deal, after the deal was implemented under the Obama administration, Iran's GDP shrunk Iran's GDP like increased by like 12.5% in the wake of the deal. This shows that like by implementing the deal, we're putting them on such a huge platform. And from what we've heard in the opening half, there's some sort of mutual agreement that Iran as a country doesn't have its values in check. Iran as a country is independent, right? Everyone in this debate seems to agree on the fact that Iran is a problematic nation. So why are we even remotely allowing them to have remote power, right? By lifting sanctions on them and allowing them, hey, here's a deal. This deal doesn't include missile programs. This deal doesn't do anything about their inhumane acts, right? Oh, and by the way, closing opposition is going to tell you about a deal in 1979 that somehow covers all this. That's false. Also, I'm in protected time, right? So by entering this deal, we allow Iran to develop as a nation, and thus, because we want to live in a safe world, in a peaceful world, we side with the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Member of Government. Let's have the Member of Opposition here. Thank you, Member of Opposition. Let's have the last speaker of Government Bench, Government Whip. Here.
Just 1 second while I set up my timer. All right, let's begin now. Panel, power in Iran's hand is bad, and we must establish that. This debate has gone heavily messy, and that is why I, as Government Whip, will come and explain why power in Iran's hand is bad, which closing opposition has completely forgone and misunderstood this debate. Iran as a whole is a nuclear power. We have seen in the Iran versus Iraq war, we have seen the way that Iran can impact the entire world. Nuclear power in Iran's hand will be a disastrous threat to millions and millions of lives, right? Because what's going to happen is Iran having nuclear power will not think twice before using it against other countries. This will lead to loss of civilian lives. This will lead to losses of billions. International peace will be interrupted. There will be exceptional amounts violence, there will be nuclear power threats internationally, and that is why we must establish first and foremost that power in Iran's hand is bad, right? Now, I would first like to just completely refute closing opposition's case, right? So what he came up and gave us were various arguments, right? And what were they based upon? They were based upon the simple belief that we must really, really care about, the Iranian people, right? But this is what I have to say to that, right? The Iranian people's rights are being exploited by their very own government. Their government does not have the care of their own citizens at their forefront. They are much more invested in moving towards nuclear power, right? They do not care about their own citizens' rights, right? Now they spoke about how, no, thank you. I will not take any POIs. So moving on, right? So in the entire speech, what they actually covered at this point, right? They said that these people, they don't need to suffer, right? That these millions of lives are being impacted, right? That's what his exact words were. But I'd like to ask you, billions of lives are at stake if power goes into Iran's hands. Like my previous speaker had mentioned from my side, right? He clearly mentioned about how when we're putting Iran under this Iran deal, what happens is that their GDP is growing, their economy is growing stronger. They can use more money to go into blasts. They can use more money to go into nuclear power. There are expiration dates to these kind of restrictions that have been put onto Iran. So after 10 years, Iran's GDP will be good, Iran's economy will be good, and these restrictions would be left off. So what's going to happen is they will have infinite power. So what does that happen, right? They have such amount of power that they can use their nuclear weapons to impact billions of lives, right? And let's look at the utilitarian perspective of this, right? We want to save billions of lives here at closing government, right? We want to save lives that are going to be impacted because of the power that we're leaving in Iran's hands. And we definitely do not, and if it means at the cost of a couple of million people in Iran who are being exploited by their very own government in the first place, then so be it at our side of closing government. In my speech today, I will be covering the key clashes and refuting opening opposition as well in the process of that, right? Now, looking at the clashes, the three main clashes in this debate today. Firstly was the importance of US, right? So opening opposition came up and said, the first speaker opening opposition came up and said that US doesn't have impact that much. We don't need to really care about the image. The rest of the debate also revolved around the fact of this quote unquote leverage, right? But here's what we at closing government say to that, right? We say that the US plays an important role in the control of such countries with exceptional nuclear power, right? Right now, the US economic sanctions that President Trump had started, they're heavily being implemented, and they're really helping to get Iran back to the place. And they're not moving towards a nuclear power because these economic sanctions are there, which are not letting their economy grow, right? Which is what my member explained as well. Secondly, the next clash was whether these sanctions actually work, right? So opening opposition came up and gave this very weird argument, right? They said that when we have these economic sanctions, there will be more political growth and there'll be more growth of weapons. But here's, and there was a similar case that was brought up by closing opposition as well, right? But here's what we at closing government want to clear this out, right? We are telling you that the economy of Iran grows under the Iran deal, right? Because there are no sanctions on it. So it's continuously growing, the GDP is increasing, and this is what closing opposition also agreed to. So what we're seeing is Iran is growing, and at the end of the day, when these restrictions on nuclear deals are revoked, right? What's going to happen is they will have power. I can explain this time and time again, and that is why it's important for this deal not to be implemented, right? And the final clash was about the long-term effects, right? Opening opposition came up and gave us that, these sanctions don't work, and if we put sanctions, there'll be more political growth. And the entire case that closing opposition came up and made regarding long-term effects is that, oh, well, if Iran joins this, if we have this deal, then more people in Iran will be impacted and they will be completely fine. Again, we must remember that there is a time expiration on this entire deal, right? And these people, there is no control over their missiles. They don't have any control over their ballistics. How are you going to control this, right? And that's the major question. Panel, in this debate, what's been heavily forgotten is that the motion clearly states with the original terms of the Iran deal unchanged. We must remember, as my member has repeated, we know that there's a timeline there's an expiration date on these restrictions. Once they're left, Iran will be all powerful, ready to create impacts on various countries, and this will be really negative impact that will impact international peace for years and years to come. What if we told you specifically at closing government, which leads for us to be a much higher role in this debate, right? We've told you the most important things. We've told you that these original terms will not change, they will not work, they will only give Iran much more power sooner or later. We have told you that under this deal, there will be economic growth, which will impact the world heavily later. Countries will regret their decision at this point of time. Sanctions put in place lead to lesser economic If Iran was just so great and cared all about its citizens, why does it still have a nuclear program still in place, ready to start off whenever they want? They are still in the process of trying to get power, and putting power into Iran's hands will be really, really bad for the entire world, because what's going to happen is it's going to hamper international peace. And I'm sure that most of the sides in this debate today have agreed that we don't want power in Iran's hands. We want a nuclear-free world, and just giving Iran this power 5 years, 6 years down the line with these terms unchanged is horrible. Panel, if Iran was not planning on using nuclear warheads, it is ironical that it has its nuclear program working even when it was under the Iran deal. And for all these reasons, I beg you to propose, and this is why I think we've won the debate today. Thank you.
Thank you, Government Whip. Let's have the last speaker of this debate, Opposition Whip. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, just some seconds to organize my scripts. Okay. Ask the POIs in text, not in voice channel. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So, Mr. Speaker, first of all, why in this debate, I'm starting with the rebuttals for the CG team, right? The CG believes that Iran wishes to bomb, and for that the sanction is okay to them. But they never say that why Iran wishes to bomb to countries or things. Having nuclear weapons doesn't mean that you wish to bomb every people. And whenever they never shows us that exact reason, they are so much assertive to prove in this debate that why the CG's case is very much proven in this debate, right? So second of all, that CG is shameful because they say that it's okay to deprive millions of people, Iranian peoples, and it's okay to make their lives more very much bad for this scenario, right? But the problematic thing that CG claims in this debate that the government is blamed for their people's deprivation or this type of things. It's not okay. Because of why? Because first of all, think about a country who is under economic sanction. That means that my previous speaker showed you that how exactly the millions of people's dreams are getting destroyed day by day. And even they are not getting nutrition, or they are not getting food. They cannot trade any of them. I'm not taking it. So they are not getting any types of developments in their scenario. So whenever this happens, so just think about it, like in which world that Iran will go extreme with the scenario, because in our world, whenever we actually uplifting the sanctions, that means that they are actually they have no nuclear weapons, and also that means that they can grow very good, and that is okay because the Iranian people can get the things for themselves, right? But the thing about their world, in their world, whenever the Iran will go extreme for, because why? Because number one, whenever the countries will start to give sanctions on them, that means the people will go at the last stage of these deprivations or last stage of this type of destroying the dreams, so last stage of the bad things, right? So whenever the Iran government will see these things, I'm not taking Iran government will see this, that the country's people are actually destroying everything. Country's people are being destroyed by the sanctions of these things. They will more likely to bomb your in the world to show uplifting the sanctions or this type of things, because of the things that we have proved, that how exactly we are actually showing or how exactly we are mitigating all of the problems and making a better piece of world in this scenario. We promise to prove you that three things in this debate, that Iran just, like, the thing is that Iran just wants to survive, right? This is why they agreed to Obama, and this is why after Trump pulled out, they didn't immediately go and start making nuclear power again, because they're waiting to got the sanctions off from them, and also they want to actually and they because they have suffered enough for this type of things. Whenever you were actually making the deal, that USA or other countries can control the nuclear fire. And also, whenever the entire government case that tells you that how exactly this the intergovernment case tries to tell you that how exactly whenever the growth is happening, that means they are more very powerful. But this thing about this thing, the growing about GDPI or growing about a good country doesn't mean that you have a more powerful, because we are already removing their nuclear powers from our side. And also, this is actually we can tell you that it's a tiger without no claws, because we already removed the clause and already mitigating the harm things from Iran. And lastly, because whenever we are actually thinking about like the things,
Point of information.
I'm not taking it. So whenever we are actually telling you that the things that the checks and balance and regulations is coming from our wall, in their wall, Iran is making, Iran is actually, whenever you are actually not negotiations with those people, that means that whenever giving upon sanctions on them, that means that Iran will more likely to things go on bad and bad. And also, it's unlikely to have it's unlikely to have the country have nuclear powers, and you are actually making making their lives hell and hell, right? So this thing about whenever these people assuming that the fear that the Iran will bomb you, that's not actually happening in their world. Also, our world will become more better comparatively than any other debate, because it's a comparative debate where we can show you that the more good is happening in our side, and the marginal benefits are very good, because whenever there is no harm, we have showed that my previous speaker and I am trying to show you in this debate is actually and that is not harming any people in our side, because the US policies that are not unchanged, and these US policies that is constant, the consistency of these policies actually not harming any other people. Also, whenever you are actually giving sanctions, it harms in three ways. Number one, it harms by giving the sanctions of their economic growth. Now, second of all, it's harming the people's and pushing the people's millions of lives, pushing them to poverty. And number three, it's actually a very constant thing for any other countries in the world, because whenever they will get back to very much bad situation, they will nevertheless they will try to bomb you or try to act extreme to show not to pushing them back anymore, right? So also in the comparatives, we try to eradicating all of this from our world. And also the thing about the infrastructure developing or this type of things actually making them peaceful, and not because whenever the USA or the other countries will uplifting the sanctions, Iran will be more likely to stay in the check and balances, because they know even if they try to do any harm to those countries or by those by any types of bombs or except nuclear weapons, we know that these peoples or these countries can maintain the situations for ourselves. And also whenever this type of structural reasons that we have gave from ourselves, and it's sure it's more likely to happen in our world, that the access the access of nutrition, access of education, or this access of trades is more likely to good for all of life. It's good for the US and their allies, and also for Iran's in the world. And also we are debating from third party lens. We are not taking the Iran's eyes, or we are not taking the US's benefits. We are trying to tell you that how much you get you can give from our world the better outcomes to all of these people, to US people, to Iran people, and to make the world more consistency for you. And lastly, okay, so how much time have wait? Okay, can you tell me that how much time, because I
it's 8 minutes already.
You never give me the 7 minutes. I'm sorry, but we are proposing that why we are making the world, and we have showed it. So thank you, everyone. I sorry because I thought you will give me the.
No problem. Sorry, it's apologies for me too. All right,
That's why
thank
I didn't
you.
start my thing.
Thank you, Opposition Whip, and thank you to all speakers in this debate. Everyone here can head over to the main session while the judges deliberate. Thank you.
Like, when will breaks be announced?